History behind Hamnet, William Shakespeare's wife and family. Thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. Maggie O'Farrell's award-winning best-selling novel, Hamnet, has been transformed into a film. It stars Jessie, Buckley, and Paul Mescal, and is getting rave reviews. Hamnet attempts to fill in the gaps in our knowledge of the family and personal life of one of the greatest writers of all time, William Shakespeare, and hypothesizes that his most famous play, Hamlet, was inspired by the tragic childhood death of his son. But what do we actually know about the real Agnes Hathaway and Susanna, Hamnet and Judith Shakespeare? How much of Hamnet is historic fact? And how plausible is the postulation? Come hither and hark, as verily we perpend the tidings of the bard. First, here is what we know from historical record about William Shakespeare's personal life. He was born in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, a market town in central England, about 2 days' journey northwest of London. This countryside brims with farms and was once bordered by the vast Forest of Arden. William's father, John Shakespeare, was a younger son of a yeoman farmer. As he did not inherit land, he apprenticed to a glover and leather worker and became successful in the trade. He married up to Mary Arden, the youngest daughter of an affluent family, who took their name from the Arden Forest. The surname Shakespeare means exactly what it sounds like. It was a descriptive surname for someone who did shake, Old English for brandish, a spear. The name was first recorded in 1248 as belonging to a man named William Shakespeare, who was hanged in Gloucestershire for robbery. Most likely, one of his ancestors was a warrior who took his name from his weapon of choice. The moniker pops up all over England with various spellings, but especially in Warwickshire. John Shakespeare moved his wife Mary into a townhouse. He had a good head for business and far surpassed the wealth of a small-town tradesman. He purchased land and houses and rented them out. He was elected borough ale tester, then an alderman, bailiff, chief magistrate, and eventually mayor of Stratford in 1568. Mary bore 8 children: Joan, Margaret, William, Gilbert, Joan, Anne, Richard, and Edmund. Sadly, the first Joan, Margaret, and Anne all died in childhood. William was the eldest of the 5 surviving Shakespeare children. He was baptized on April 26, 1564. Though the exact date of his birth is unknown, it is generally celebrated on April 23rd, as this is St. George's Day and also, poetically, the day Shakespeare would eventually die. Though no attendance records survive, William was probably educated at King's New School in Stratford. The grammar school provided instruction in Latin, standardized by royal decree. When he was 12, his father purchased 2 additional homes to the west of their current townhouse and joined them together into one grand McMansion for his growing family. But in the following years, John's fortunes inexplicably fell, possibly due to his involvement in black market wool trading, and he lost his public offices and social standing. Just over a mile away, in the village of Shottery, lived a girl named Agnes, or Anne Hathaway, not to be confused with the Oscar-winning American actress born in 1982. Agnes and Anne were likely used interchangeably. Most historical sources refer to her as Anne, but her father's will, perhaps more intimately, calls her Agnes. She may have been born in 1556 in Hathaway Cottage, then known as Hewland Farm. Cottage is a bit of a misnomer, as the 12-room, timber-framed, thatch-roofed home was quite palatial. Agnes's father, Richard Hathaway, was a prosperous yeoman farmer with several hundred acres to his name, which he rented out to tenants. Her mother must have died at some point, though we don't know when, how, or even what her name was. We only know that Richard took a second wife, Joan Ann Kettle. Richard died in September 1581 and left his daughter the sum of 10 marks to be paid at the day of her marriage. Her brother, Bartholomew, inherited the house and farm. The lack of records about Agnes Hathaway has been a fascinating mystery for centuries. If you like solving historical mysteries, then you'll love June's Journey. When Claire is murdered under mysterious circumstances, her sister June crosses an ocean, determined to solve the case. You can help June on her journey by playing this hidden objects mystery game and enjoying the thrilling storyline and compelling characters, all set in the glamorous 1920s. The visual puzzles and beautiful illustrations keep you engaged as you master scenes, level up, get rewards, and collect resources and rare items. Download June's Journey for free by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code. June's Journey is available on iOS and Android mobile devices and on PC. On November 28, 1582, Agnes married a man she had likely known most of her life, William Shakespeare. It is believed that she was 26 years old and he only 18. A marriage license was issued on November 27th for William Shakespeare and one Anne Wheatley. The following day, 2 friends of the Hathaway family signed a surety of £40 as guarantee that no lawful claims impeded the marriage between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. The Worcester Chancellor allowed the marriage banns to be read only once instead of the usual 3 times, indicating the marriage may have been arranged in some haste. 6 months later, in May 1583, Agnes gave birth to a daughter, Susanna. 20 months after that, a set of twins, Hamnet and Judith, followed. They were baptized on February 2nd, 1585. After the birth of the twins, little is known of William's life, until he was first recorded as part of the London theatre scene in 1592. These 7 lost years have sprung up many apocryphal tales about how he ended up in London. The 1592 document in question was a scathing critique by fellow playwright Robert Greene. He called William an upstart crow and thought very little of the country bumpkin turned thespian. Despite Greene's vitriol, he does provide evidence that suggests Shakespeare was well established by 1592, this time making a name worthy of the great Robert Greene to besmirch, likely accounted for Shakespeare's lost years. What Agnes, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith were up to in Stratford while their husband and father was treading the boards in London is somewhat mysterious. They were probably getting on with the business of life. Documents indicate that the Shakespeare household was producing malt, a key ingredient in brewing ale. William was listed as head of household on these documents, but it was almost certainly Agnes doing the work. Documents also show that the household, meaning Agnes, hosted important businessmen and clergymen visiting the village. All this suggests that she contributed to the family income and enabled them to invest in large property. Hamnet may have been educated at the local grammar school, like his father, but his sisters would not have been permitted to attend. Anything they learned would have been taught to them by their mother, who was most likely illiterate. There is evidence that they could each sign their names, but little else. It is not clear when Shakespeare first put pen to paper, but once he did, he produced magic. Richard III, The Taming of the Shrew, Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, and Henry V all dripped from his quill in these early years. His plays were performed by his own company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Their patron, Henry Carey, Baron Hunsdon, was Anne Boleyn's nephew and served as Lord Chamberlain to his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Word got out about the wonderful plays this company was performing, and people came from high and low to Shoreditch to watch. By 1594, Shakespeare was an in-demand byline. His plays were published and sold widely. Though his business was in London and he took lodgings in Bishopsgate, William spent at least some time home in Stratford with his family, most likely during the winter months, when theatres, which were usually open air and performed in daylight, were shuttered. Therefore, William was likely not home in the summer of 1596, when his 11-year-old son, Hamnet, died. What caused his demise was not recorded. He was buried on August 11th in Holy Trinity Churchyard in Stratford. The following year, William purchased New Place, the second largest house in Stratford, for Agnes and his daughters. The grand house had 10 fireplaces and 20 rooms. He paid the considerable sum of £60. The man he bought it from, William Underhill, died suddenly the following year. His son, Fulk, was later found guilty of poisoning his father to get his hands on Shakespeare's £60. Fulk was hanged for patricide. William's acting and writing made him a wealthy man. The Lord Chamberlain's men were self-owned, and in 1599 they put their profits towards the construction of a new theatre, the Globe, on the south bank of the River Thames. Queen Elizabeth I invited them to court for royal command performances. Despite what you see in Shakespeare in Love, the Queen was not traipsing through the mud to the Globe with the unwashed masses. After Her Majesty died in 1603, the Lord Chamberlain's men were awarded a royal patent by the new king, James I. So they changed their name to the King's Men. William wrote Macbeth in 1605 to flatter his new Scottish patron. William also continued to act until at least 1610, though the parts he played were not well documented. He continued to keep one foot in Stratford and one in London. In 1605, he invested in shares in the Stratford Parish Tides. In 1608, he purchased Blackfriars Theatre in London. It has oft been repeated, though not verified, that William retired to Stratford some years before his death. In 1607, his eldest daughter Susanna married physician John Hall. A year later, she had a daughter, Elizabeth. After 1610, William's literary output slowed down. His last 3 plays were collaborations, probably with John Fletcher, who succeeded him as playwright for the King's Men. There are no works attributed to the bard after 1613. He retired just before the Globe Theatre burned down during a performance of Henry VIII. In February 1616, Judith married vintner Thomas Quinley. A month later, Shakespeare signed his last will and testament, which he began by describing himself as being in perfect health. The following day, his new son-in-law was found guilty of fathering an illegitimate son by Margaret Wheeler, both of whom had died in childbirth. Thomas was ordered to do public penance, which would have deeply embarrassed the Shakespeare family. Less than a month later, on April 23, 1616, William Shakespeare died at the age of 52. His wife and daughters were at his bedside. Exactly how he died is unknown, though the local vicar later recorded that he had gone out drinking with fellow writers Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton. They overindulged, and Shakespeare contracted a fever. He was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, just a few yards away from his beloved son Hamnet. His will left New Place and the bulk of his estate to his eldest daughter, Susanna, under the stipulation that she pass it down intact to the first son of her body. However, she had only one child, Elizabeth, who had no children of her own. Judith had 3 sons, Shakespeare, Richard, and Thomas, but all 3 died in their youth, so William Shakespeare has no direct descendants. The man who wrote so many honeyed words failed to mention his wife in his will, other than to leave her my second best bed and furniture. Some argue this is evidence of resentment, while others point to the fact that his widow was entitled to 1/3 of his estate, and that, according to Tudor custom, the first best bed was for guests, while the second best would have been their marriage bed and filled with sentimental significance. Agnes outlived her husband by at least 7 years. She died on August 6, 1623, and was interred next to him. Her daughter, Susanna, is believed to have composed her epitaph. "Mother, you gave me the breast, you gave me milk and life. Woe is me, that for so great a gift my return will be a tomb. Come quickly, Christ, that my mother, though shut in a tomb, may rise again and seek the stars." Now that we've covered the slim historic facts about Shakespeare's family and personal life, let's dive in to the centuries of speculation. Agnes and the Shotgun Wedding. Hamnet imagines Agnes as a nature child and healer. Rumors circle that her long-dead mother is a witch and that she is clairvoyant. This is fantasy, mostly. There is no evidence that Agnes gave birth in the woods or predicted the future, though witch trials in England didn't really heat up until the reign of James I in 1603. These behaviors would have sparked social stigma. It is more reasonable to assume that Agnes was a devout member of the Church of England. However, Shakespeare's plays are populated by women with magic, healing, and clairvoyant talents. It's not impossible to imagine that he was inspired by a woman in his own life. It was perfectly normal for Tudor women to keep healing gardens and understand how to use herbs to treat minor wounds and illnesses. It is quite likely that William drew on his wife's real knowledge in his writing. The desire to match the incredible genius of Shakespeare to an equally remarkable partner is certainly understandable. And with the modern chic of witchcraft and nature, it's easy to see how this fantasy was born. The age gap between William and Agnes has garnered many unflattering assumptions. For centuries, male historians cast her as a woman on the verge of spinsterhood, who used a moment of teenage lust to trap a brilliant young man into an unhappy marriage. But there are several problems with this theory. First of all, we don't know for sure that Agnes was 26 when she wed. Her date of birth is assumed because her grave says she was 67 when she died in 1623. But grave markers are not considered reliable. They were usually carved by illiterate artisans who regularly inverted or misread numbers. Even if she was 26, she was far from a spinster. We're used to the idea of royals marrying in their teens, but most 16th century people married in their mid-20s. We do know William's date of birth from his baptismal record. 18 was especially young for a groom. Most men wed around 27 after completing a 7-year apprenticeship. Some evidence suggests arrangements had been made for William to train as a butcher. Apprentice indentures prohibited marriage. By wedding Agnes, William would have nullified any apprentice arranged for him. It is possible that he wanted to marry Agnes because it would get him out of a safe and predictable life in trade. It is untrue that Agnes got all the advantage from the marriage. In reality, she came from a family of higher social standing and had an inheritance of her own, while he was not yet a wealthy actor and the most famous playwright of all time, but a country boy with limited prospects. It is quite likely that he pursued her, rather than the other way around. It is also not likely that he was trapped into marriage. Agnes was indeed 3 months pregnant when they wed, but this was quite normal at the time. Many couples in love had a hand-fasting ceremony, where they plighted their troth or exchanged vows before witnesses. After this, they were free to sleep together, and would only go ahead with a church wedding once a baby was on the way. A third of English women were demonstratively pregnant on their wedding day. As long as they got hitched in a church before the baby was actually born, they faced no discipline or social stigma. Handfasts were traditionally performed on Lammas Day, August 1st. This timeline works perfectly with the conception of Susanna later in August. The wedding in November, before Advent began, as marriages were not permitted for 6 weeks during Advent and Christmastide, and the baby being born in May. It is therefore quite plausible that William and Agnes had a fully planned marriage in accordance with the traditions of their time. The discrepancy in the surnames of William's bride, Anne Wheatley on the marriage license and Anne Hathaway on the bond, have led to speculation that he was involved with two different women. When the Hathaway family learned that he planned to marry Anne Wheatley, they forced him to wed their pregnant kinswoman instead. However, this is not likely. The bond was signed by two witnesses who knew the couple and ensured that the names were written correctly, while the license was filled in by a clerk, along with many other pieces of information. It is reasonable to assume that the clerk made a mistake, and that there was only ever one Anne involved. There is no evidence of a woman named Anne Wheatley in the area. How did Hamnet die, and was Hamlet about him? We know that William had a son, Hamnet, who died at 11, but how he perished is a mystery. The book Hamnet postulates that he succumbed to the plague. This is a reasonable assumption, as there were frequent outbreaks of Yersinia pestis, the most famous in 1346, known as the Black Death, wiped out an estimated 50% of Europe. The devastating bacterial infection popped up repeatedly for centuries after. Between 1603 and 1610, the Globe Theatre was shuttered for a total of 60 months to avoid the spread of infection. Shakespeare likely spent some of this quarantine time at home in Stratford. The last major plague pandemic in England was in 1666, but the disease continued to attack the world until the 20th century, when antibiotics were developed. In Hamnet, it is Judith who first falls ill. The book suggests that she contracted the bubonic form of the disease, the most common, which was transmitted via the bite of a flea or lice. A patient experiences chills, malaise, fever, muscle cramps and seizures, painful lymph gland swellings called buboes in the neck, armpits, and groin. Bubonic plague has an 80% mortality rate. Judith's devoted brother cares for her and lays beside her. My theory is that the close proximity caused Hamnet to contract a different form of the plague, pneumonic. This is caused by inhaling airborne droplets when an infected person coughs or sneezes. The bacteria then infects the lungs, causing fever, headache, shortness of breath, chest pain, coughing, and hallucinations, as Hamnet experienced. Pneumonic plague increases the death rate to 90%. This, I believe, is why the character Judith recovered, and Hamnet did not. Of course, we don't have any historic evidence that Judith was ever sick. There are no surviving letters or journals of William's reaction to the loss of his only son. While early death was tragically common in the past, people deeply grieved the loss of their children. After 1596, there were subtle changes in the tone of his plays, with increasing themes of grief, child loss, and paternal guilt. The first work he produced after Hamnet's death, King John, delves into themes of guilt about placing a public obligation over family duty. In 1600, 4 years after Hamnet's death, William wrote Hamlet, a tragedy about a young man who is confronted by the ghost of his father, who asks him to avenge his death. It includes many ruminations on mortality, including the famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy. While Hamlet is not a one-to-one allegory for the death of his son, the play explores many of the thoughts William was likely processing in his own grief, and the poignant relationship between father and son, one on this side of the mortal veil, and one on the other. Tradition says, though history cannot verify, that William played the role of the ghost of Hamlet's father. The name Hamlet was interchangeable with Hamnet, like John or Johnny. Most Shakespearean scholars believe that his greatest work was in some way a tribute to his son. Another reference to Shakespeare's real life is found in Twelfth Night. Twin brother and sister, Sebastian and Viola, are in a shipwreck. Viola believes that her brother drowned, but he later appears miraculously unharmed, and the twins are happily reunited. Perhaps this was William's way of reuniting Hamnet and Judith, if only on the stage. Was Shakespeare trying to get away from his wife and family for a glamorous life in London? Along with the shotgun wedding theory, it was assumed for centuries that William saw his marriage as a disastrous mistake, and he couldn't get away from Agnes fast enough. The 1998 film Shakespeare in Love briefly mentions a wife forgotten in Stratford, while William rolls around in bed with another woman. There is no evidence that he ever had a mistress in London, though some have pointed to his so-called Dark Lady sonnets as evidence of his admiration for a woman of Mediterranean or African ancestry. William was not living large in London. He kept modest lodgings and spent most of his time in the city working hard at the theater. He sent the bulk of his considerable fortune back to his family, buying them a fine house and investing in local property and ventures. If you want to know where Shakespeare's heart really was, follow the money. The amount of time he spent away from his family may have caused tension in the marriage, but we have no letters of complaint or love between he and Agnes, simply because she probably could not write or read them. In 1794, a teenage boy named William Henry Ireland visited Stratford with his father, Samuel. They hoped to uncover long-lost Shakespeare relics, but were sorely disappointed to find none. William Henry decided to brighten his old man's disappointment by claiming that a friend, who wished to remain anonymous, had shared with him a deed affixed with a genuine Shakespeare signature. Samuel was overjoyed. Glowing in his father's praise, William Henry quickly produced more documents relating to the bard, including original manuscripts for Hamlet and King Lear, with notes scribbled in the margins. He also found documents relating to Agnes, including a love letter from William with a lock of his hair, and a will which gave her £180, a grey velvet suit, rings, and a portrait. As the slippery slope got slipperier, William Henry published a book on all of his new findings, and postulated a genuine love between William and Agnes. He then claimed to have discovered a whole new play, Vortigern and Rowena. London's Drury Lane Theatre jumped at the chance to stage this fresh Shakespearean work. They paid £300 for the rights and promised half the profits to the Irelands. This is where the lies began to unravel. Actors, eagerly memorizing these long-lost lines, noticed they were far more simplistic than the previous soliloquies they'd uttered. It was even suggested that the play open on April Fool's Day, but Ireland demanded that the work be taken seriously. Someone passed the script to Shakespearean scholar Edmund Malone. He read the play and Ireland's other supposed documents with growing outrage. He published a scathing 400-page treatise, tearing the documents apart and convincing the public that they could be nothing more than modern forgeries. Vortigern and Rowena opened to a jeering crowd and closed that very night. It was never staged again. In humiliation, William Henry Ireland published another book admitting to his forgery. His reputation was ruined, but he did make a tidy sum. In 2025, strips of a letter, which had been used in the binding of a theological book in the 1600s, were uncovered. The letter was addressed to a good Mrs. Shakespeare, who had previously dwelt with her husband at Trinity Lane in London. The Hereford Cathedral letter is believed to be a genuine relic and indicates that Agnes lived with her husband for some time in his London residence. This new piece of information casts a fresh light on their relationship. Maggie O'Farrell is by no means the first person to imagine a richer life for Shakespeare's enigmatic wife. In 1870, Harriet Beecher Stowe, American author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, visited Stratford and was inspired to pen the short fiction, The True Story of Mrs. Shakespeare's Life. In it, Anne confesses on her deathbed that her husband maintained his place atop London's theatre scene by inviting his rivals back home to Stratford, where he and Anne murdered them and buried them under a mulberry tree. A similarly outlandish deathbed confession is found in Arliss Ryan's 2010 novel, The Secret Confessions of Anne Shakespeare, in which Anne admits that she was in fact the real author of William's many great plays. It seems most likely that the truth of William and Agnes's relationship lies somewhere between the extremes. Hamnet claims this middle, more nuanced ground, that Agnes encouraged her husband to chase his dreams in London, but still resented his time away and missed him deeply. Whatever sentiment the couple did or did not share during Shakespeare's productive era, he did spend his final years in Stratford, reunited with his wife, 2 daughters, and granddaughter. The 2018 film All Is True, starring Kenneth Branagh and Judi Dench, explores William's final years at home, reconnecting with his family. And in the end, he is spending eternity next to Agnes. So, in the words of the bard himself, I would not wish any companion in the world but you. Download June's Journey for free by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code. A special thank you goes to my courtier level channel members, Teresa Liu, Blinkcat B, Becky Braun, Javonti, and Carol Carver. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other history videos. You can also support my work, get early access to all my multi-part series, and other perks by becoming a channel member or joining my Patreon. Thank you for watching.